Welcome to another lesson on our Intro to Cloud Computing course. In this lesson, we'll be exploring the topic of security in AWS. Some of the topics we'll be covering are the AWS shared responsibility. That's how AWS and the customer share responsibility, right, for security. So who's in charge of what, who's expected to do what in this relationship, right, between the infrastructure and the actual users of that infrastructure, the customers. Then we have user permissions and access, AWS organizations compliance. We'll explore a very particular type of attack that threatens a lot of services online. Those are denial of service attacks. And then, of course, we'll talk about some additional security services in the big catalog, right, that AWS has to offer. So first, go ahead and watch that intro video from the AWS instructors. And when you're ready, we'll continue and we'll talk about the AWS shared responsibility model. All right, so go ahead and watch this video as well on AWS shared responsibility model. Once you're ready, you can continue here on the video and on the slides. All right, so what do we mean by the shared responsibility model? So throughout this course, you've learned about a variety of resources that you can create in the AWS cloud. We've talked about compute, right, through EC2. We've talked about storage through S3. We've talked about databases, right, if we're kind of storing our data in a more accessible manner. If we want to retrieve it really quickly, then we're going to go with databases. So who's responsible for keeping all that data secure? Well, is it you? Is it AWS? The reality, it's both, right? AWS is responsible for some things in the cloud while you're responsible for others. And if you work together, if you fulfill those responsibilities correctly, then your data can be confidently secured, transmitted, whatever you're doing, right, with your applications, with your compute resources. You can trust that there's not going to be information leaks, or malicious attackers, right, coming after your data. So what is the AWS shared responsibility model? Well, it defines a division of security and compliance responsibilities between AWS, the provider, and the customer, right? The person who actually using the AWS cloud. So it ensures that both parties understand their roles in maintaining security within the cloud environment. So I can't just put an app on AWS and expect everything to run exactly how I want it to. There are still some things I need to do and configure to make sure that it works as I expect it to, right? Everyone expects their app or their service or their data, right, to work differently and to be accessed differently, depending on the company you work for. Do you have customers that you need to share this data with, right? Your particular situation means that you have to do some work in terms of the responsibility model, the responsibility of securing your data and your applications. So when we're talking about the customer responsibilities, we're talking about security in the cloud. So once you have your resources deployed, right, once you're using the cloud, you're responsible for the configurations in the cloud. And then AWS responsibilities are referred to the security of the cloud. So notice those different prepositions, right, in and of. So AWS sets up all the infrastructure, does handle some security, right, make sure there's redundancy, right. If there's a failure in one data center, right, they'll have another. We'll talk about how they actually physically secure, right, those data centers as well. But as far as like actually using it, as far as being in the cloud, you have to do some of that work yourself. All right, so let's talk about the AWS responsibilities. AWS keeps talking about security, right, keeping things secure, but it also says we have to do things right. So what are they even in charge of? Well, they're in charge of physical security. So they do have their data centers, right, hardware, global network infrastructure. That not only means being resistant to failure, right, if one data center goes down, being able to secure your data in other centers, back it up, right, redundancy, but also physical security, right? They have security guards outside these data centers, right, making sure that people aren't, causing havoc, right, at the actual brick and mortar locations. They're also making sure, right, that the infrastructure works. So that's physical security. There's network security. So there's something called DDoS attacks or DOS attacks that we'll talk about later in this lesson. So they're in charge of encryption as well, making sure that the data is protected, right, whether it's being stored or transmitted. And then of course firewalls, that the firewalls, those protections, disallowing unauthorized users, right, unauthorized traffic from coming into your networks, making sure that those firewalls actually do work. And then there's also compute and storage security, so actually maintaining the services like EC2, S3, Lambda, etc., making sure that those services and the software and the APIs underlying them work. And then there's compliance and auditing. So AWS actually helps you with compliance. If you're a medical organization, for example, you might have to comply with HIPAA regulations. That's regulations involving the protection of medical data, right? Medical information. That's extremely sensitive information, right? The diseases people have, the health history, all of that is extremely sensitive and protected under HIPAA law, HIPAA regulations. If you're running a medical service or handling medical data on the AWS cloud, maybe in a database or maybe in S3, maybe you have people's like X-rays, for example. AWS actually has tools to make sure that you are following the rules, right? So that your services aren't potentially breaking any regulations. And that's extremely important, right? Not in just making your services work, but also making sure that they work under the rule of law or certain, industry rules and regulations. So yeah, AWS has got your back in pretty much all of those areas. So AWS operates, manages, and controls the components at all layers of infrastructure. So that includes the host operating system, virtualization, physical, all the stuff that makes the cloud work. They're going to make sure to secure it. So again, they manage the security of the cloud, specifically the physical infrastructure, and of course, right, even the virtualization, operating systems, all that stuff. So the actual cloud, they're going to make sure it works and that it's secure. That's kind of the whole appeal of the cloud, right? That you don't have to handle all those things on your own. You don't have to set up your own data center. But in actually using, right, and setting up your apps on the cloud, you still have some responsibilities, right? AWS can't do everything for you. So that's security in the cloud, the customer responsibilities. So you actually have to secure your apps, your data, and your configurations. So you have to make sure that you tell AWS how you want to use the cloud, so that they're making sure that, hey, we're not going to let the wrong people in to your S3 bucket. We're going to make sure that only this type of traffic, right, has access to this EC2 instance. You have to tell AWS, right, how you want your apps to be protected. So you can do that primarily through the access management, IAM, right? So if you're a big organization, right, they're all working on your application, on your service, your website. You got to make sure that the different roles are partitioned, right? Not everybody should have access to delete the entire EC2 instance, right? That would be terrible, especially if your production software, right, is running on that instance. So I can tell you as a developer, and I started off as a junior developer, right, at my company, I didn't have unrestricted access to every single part of the software, even though I was helping build the software. I had limitations to what I could and couldn't do. So typically I would only have access to development and test instances. So as we're, testing things out, adding new things to the application, to our software, we had separate instances that would handle that. Now, the production instance, the one that actual users were using all over the world, I couldn't mess with that. I didn't have access to that, because if I made a mistake on those instances, it'd create downtime, right, for the users. It would potentially affect, right, the availability of that application, right, if I made a critical error, right, in one of those updates. And then there's data protection. So you got to also make sure you set up policies for backing up the data, how you want to encrypt the data, right? Do you want some data to be wide open? Do you want other data to be protected, right? There's application security. You got to make sure that you're updating OS software, right? Especially if you're doing the infrastructure as a service, where you have to manage all those certain things. If you're doing platform as a service, then application security, a lot of these things will be handled automatically. But yeah, if you're doing like EC2 instance, right, you have to be deciding, hey, which OS is the best one for me, and making sure that you're using the newest version. There's also network configuration. We talked about that already, right? So this is part of the customer responsibility. Sure, you can stick your app in the cloud, but do you want your app to be wide open for anyone to use? Do you want your app to be used only by the people in your company? Do you want a mix of both, where some parts of the app are accessible to the public and others are private to only people in your organization? That's where VPCs, right, networks, access control lists, all that stuff helps manage who goes in and out, right, of your applications and your networks. So that's part of the customer responsibility, right? AWS can't predict, what parts of your app you want wide open and what parts you don't. And then, of course, there's compliance requirements. Only you know, right, what type of organization you are, what type of rules and laws you're trying to follow. Of course, AWS does have tools that will help you satisfy these compliance requirements more easily. So you don't have to be an expert in compliance, right? AWS can help you along the way. And then we have more on the shared responsibility model, right? More on what the customer does. So you're responsible for managing the security requirements for your content, including content that you choose to store on AWS. You have to decide again, do you want it public? Do you want it private? If it is private, right, who has access to do what, right? What sort of permissions are they going to have? And in this week's lab, you're actually going to have you're going to get some experience setting up those permissions, limiting what a particular user can do with a particular service, such as EC2, S3, etc. So the security steps that you take depend on factors such as the services that you use, the complexity of your system, and your company's specific security needs, right? Only you know what your company needs. Only you know what your app needs, what your website needs. Again, some parts might be wide open, others might be might need more security, right, and less access. All right, so here's a little diagram, right, on the division of labor, you can say, right, when it comes to security in the cloud. So AWS handles software, all the different resources, right, compute, storage, database, networking resources. They handle the hardware, right, the regions, availability zones, edge locations. They make sure that this is not only up and running, but also working as intended. No data leaking, right, between people's instances and so forth. And then there's customers, right? You have to decide, how do you want your data to be secured? Do you want some of it to be accessible to the public, to your customers, or do you want some of it to be encrypted, right, and protected under, networks or firewall? So yeah, AWS has all those tools so that you get exactly what you're looking for from the cloud. So you can think of the model as being similar to the division of responsibilities between a homeowner and a home builder. So AWS would be the builder. They build your house and ensuring that it's built, solidly, that it's not going to fall apart. When a wind comes by, right, or maybe a small earthquake, they got to build it right under certain standards. As the homeowner, though, the customer, in the case of the cloud, it's your responsibility to secure everything in the house, right? You got to make sure that you put locks where you need locks. You got to make sure that the keys, right, are easy to find, right? I know some people put the key under the rug, right, and are surprised, right, when people find it and are able to break into their house. This is the same for the cloud. Although AWS gives you the structure for you to host your applications, you have to decide, right, how people go in and out of those applications, just like you do with a house, right, if you were a homeowner. All right, so next up will be permissions and access.